The following is from Death of Vishnu by Manil Suri. In this passage, the speaker describes Mrs. Asrani. Read this passage carefully. In a well-written essay, explain how the writer uses such elements as diction, imagery, figurative language, and point of view to characterize Mrs. Asrani. Point of view meaning who is telling the story, and why or what do we know because of it, or because of this. Diction, word choice. Imagery, touch, taste, sound, hear, feel. Figurative language, metaphor, simile, personification, those types of things. An excerpt from the Death of Vishnu, Manil Suri. Squatting on the floor in front of the dressing table mirror, Mrs. Asrani was in the midst of applying True Tone to her hair when the doorbell rang. "Can you get that?" she shouted to Mr. Asrani. If it's the meat walla, buy a kilo, and don't let him give you all bones like he did the last time. Okay, she's squatting. Squatting is uncomfortable. So right off the bat, we start off with uncomfortable. She's applying True Tone to her hair. When the doorbell rings, she's a little bossy. Okay, and maybe even a little demanding. How do we know that? Because she shouted to Mr. Asrani, "Don't let him give you bones like he did the last time." Okay, so she doesn't want to be cheated. Around and under Miss Asrani, the floor was covered with pages of the Times of India. Okay, that gives us a location. 6 years ago, when she started dyeing her hair, Mr. Asrani and the children had quickly learned that to venture into the territory delineated by the newspaper was to risk terrible consequences. As Mrs. Asrani's ire at her aging had grown, what is ire? At her aging had grown, so also had the area she had staked out. These days, she was up to the entire Sunday edition. Okay, ire, I know, means angry. Consequences, that means there's trouble. And the kids and Mr. Asrani, they can't even go in the room when she's dyeing her hair. Okay, so this is very upsetting to her. And because she's putting the newspaper down, we know it's messy. The dye was not behaving today. Okay, that's personification. Right here. The dye was not behaving today. It didn't look vicious. Ooh, I love that word, vicious, enough. Perhaps she had not mixed the two components in the right proportions. She dipped the old toothbrush, wrapped it in gauze into the saucer of black liquid by her foot, and ran it over her head. She's using an old toothbrush wrapped in gauze into the saucer of black liquid by her foot and ran it over her head. That's imagery. Her hair was getting grayer, she could tell. Time was that a bottle of True Tone lasted over a year, but now Mr. Asrani had to be sent down to the chemist for a new bottle every 2 months. Okay, so she is frustrated, and then this is becoming, it's not lasting as long. So it's becoming more frequent. Personification, imagery. This is just details. Vicious, diction. Ire, diction. Terrible consequence, detail. Times of India, detail. Shouted, diction. Squatting, diction. Going back and labeling. Mrs. Ronnie sighed. Okay. How many more bottles of True Tone would she go through before she finally decided to quit? She hated the whole process. Okay, so we need to find some more words for frustrated. We can look that up in a minute. We need some synonyms for frustrated. Chemical smell of the dye and the way it stayed on her fingers. The long wait for it to set while it seeped out into her skin. No matter how hard she scrubbed afterwards, the marks remained for days on her forehead. Crude enhancements of her hairline that someone might have painted on to form a more decorative frame for her face. That's imagery. Whom was she trying to fool? Whom was she trying to impress? This is a rhetorical question. You guys like to use these, but you don't know what they're for. Certainly not Manohar. Who's Manohar? All he seemed to care about was his gods and his drinks. He had not commented on her. Oh, that's the husband. For how long had it been? In fact, when was the last time he had even brought her a string of jasmine? Okay, she's feeling neglected, ignored. Blossom she'd come to expect every evening in those early years, tied around her hair by his own hand. Aww, she's feeling lonely, poor lady. The buds would glow creamily in her tresses, black as coal back then, and he would squeeze the petals between to release their fragrance. This is imagery. And this is a time when she felt beautiful and pretty and desirable. But that had been before her hair had turned, before her looks had thickened, before her body had begun to spill around her every time she sat down. Oh my gosh, look at that. You missed it. Before. That repetition of the before. Why had it happened to her? Again, another rhetorical question. Manohar was no more plump than the first day he came to look at her. So here we see some envy. I have to write on this side. She's envious even of her husband. He looks the same. Men age gracefully. Women do not. It's kind of, this is like life moment right there. Hair mostly gone, it was true, but the baldness only accenting his babyish looks. And Mrs. Pathak, right next door, giving birth to her 2 children in the same 2 years, how she had retained the slimness of the immaculate brightness. It was all so unfair. More of this envy and jealousy because Mrs. Asrani feels so ugly. She's noticing all the pretty, seeing things maybe in her neighbor and her husband that aren't really there. She could feel the anger descending again. A curtain falling around, enveloping her inside its folds. That's imagery. And also this spill around her every time she sat down, that spill, that can be diction or imagery. Cause she wondered if it could be a chemical in the dye that caused this reaction month after month. She really had to give the whole thing up. She had tried to do so once last year, going an entire 2 months without using the true tone. Squiggles of white had sprouted all over her head like some crawling infestation. An infestation like bugs. Ugh, that's definitely diction. She is actually disgusted with herself. I don't even know where to write that. She's disgusted. Had turned into gaping patches. She had tied her hair tightly in a bun to hide them, but Mrs. Pathak had taken to shaking her hair loose tauntingly every time she came into the kitchen, and she had finally succumbed. So Mrs. Ronnie gives in and starts dyeing her hair because the bun just isn't working for her. Okay, so there's lots to go on here, but we have not touched point of view. Point of view is who's telling the story. Who's telling the story? And what do we know because of it? There is a narrator who is not part of the story. So this is a third person. And because we have a third person, we know how Asrani feels. We know how Ms. Asrani thinks, but we only get her side of the story. We don't know what Mr. Asrani is thinking, Manohar. We don't know what Mrs. Pathak is thinking. We don't get that. But because we have this third person limited point of view, we know how she feels. We know her thoughts and feelings, and even things that she says. But it's not straight out of her brain. Okay? Because we also know the other kids, we can see the kids, we can see Mr. Asrani, but we see them almost through her eyes, but not really through her eyes. It's that third person limited. And that's something that we can use as the point of view. So, Mrs. Asrani is several things. She's characterized as angry, prideful. She's got a lot of pride. She is frustrated. She is a little desperate. She is envious. All of these things work for the answer to the question. The author characterizes Mrs. Ronnie as any of these things for your thesis statement. Okay, I got to stop here because I'm running out of time, and I'll show you a sample paragraph in the next one.